Hi guys, welcome back aboard our 44-foot hurricane-damaged DIY catamaran project boat. With a little bit of luck, this week I should be able to vacuum infuse some new hatches for our tramp ramp that normally sits here between the two trampolines. In a previous video, I 3D scanned the two existing but badly damaged hatches with the help of a little bit of CAD magic and a pair of wonderful viewers and their spiffy CNC machine. We then transformed some MDF into two hatch molds. And here are the two glorious molds. Now I still need to get these sealed and prepped before I can actually use them. That is not that big of a deal. What is a big deal is the weather here in Florida. It's actually gotten cold here. Last night it got down to I think 45 degrees Fahrenheit. That's something like 7 degrees Celsius. And the epoxy I'll be using for all of this, it requires a minimum of 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Tonight it shouldn't get as cold, so we should be good to get these all sealed up. But as far as doing the actual infusion, well, we're just gonna have to cross our fingers for warmer weather a little bit later in the week. Around 6 years ago, I had my first experience with mold making and vacuum infusion when I built a new rudder for Athena back in Denmark. That project was a ton of fun, but it's been a long time since then. Now I have no doubt that techniques like vacuum bagging or even vacuum infusion are going to come in useful later on in the catamaran refit. So I'm considering this little mini project an opportunity to relearn what I knew 5 or 6 years ago. My goal for today is very straightforward. I want to get these prepped and get the surface coated with some epoxy so that we'll have a nice hard surface we can apply PVA to a little bit later in the week. So far, so good. This is my first ever MDF mold, so I am a bit new to this, but I took great care to wipe up any epoxy that was pooling, because if I have a little bit of epoxy that cures in, for instance, one of the nice radiuses made by the CNC machine, then getting that sanded out is going to be a right nightmare because the epoxy is much harder than the MDF. I have both of the molds coated, and as you might be able to see, there are some little fuzzies that have risen up and made the surface a bit uneven, but I think I can easily knock those down once the epoxy cures. I also coated this little piece of MDF, which is going to be my test piece. A fun little challenge I encountered was the fact that because it's so cold here at night now, the viscosity of the epoxy was well, pretty high, and that's of course something I was used to back in Denmark, but back there I had a little epoxy heating box with a silicone heating mat inside of it that I could turn on so that the epoxy was nice and low viscosity. So I actually took this and put it out in the sun with a black bag over it just to get it heated up a little bit. It makes it a lot easier to work with the epoxy when it flows better. While we are waiting for the epoxy to cure, I have something else I need to finish doing. Thanks to a couple of you guys, I now have a PDF with engine part numbers that more closely match the engines I have, instead of the exploded diagrams I found on the internet, which seems to be a different version of that engine. A lot of small differences, but yeah, I have a bunch of engine part numbers to double check. Armed with my new parts diagram and my laptop, I settled in for a fun afternoon of action-packed spreadsheet action. The majority of nuts and bolts I won't order from Myanmar, but I still need a list of what to order. I definitely don't want to order brackets or anything else that I already have, so there was a lot of running back and forth and double checking. Eventually I settled into a nice rhythm and meticulously went through each and every part on the diagram to find out if I had it or if I need to order it. I have finished my engine parts list. I think it's relatively complete. There are only a few items I can think of that I don't have on the list, but those things I will hold off and see if we actually need. But yeah, it's gonna get a little bit expensive. I've got some prices on here. These are online prices I found on this website called dieselpartsdirect.com. They seem to be middle of the road with prices. I don't know if they're particularly expensive or particularly cheap, but that's the prices I've got on here. I do have a new heat exchanger on here. I don't know if we can reuse the old one. We might be able to, so that's $2,500 I might be able to save. Other than that, I've got, bunch of little doohickeys that are missing. We've got new engine panels, new wiring harness for one of the engines. We have the other one. Then we have the extension harnesses to get from the engine all the way up to the panels. We have engine panels. Yeah, bunch of stuff. And the total here is $10,654. And that is why sometimes these videos are sponsored. Sadly not this one though. But yeah, I might be able to bring that price down a little bit, but no doubt it is gonna be expensive. The next morning I returned to partake in everybody's favorite pastime, oh glorious sanding. The epoxy made the fibers in the MDF rise up and form this rough texture, but it was easy to knock down with some 320 grit. The reason for the high grit is that I'm being very careful to not sand through the epoxy, as that would mean having to apply a whole new coat of epoxy. For the inside corners, I busted out my new secret weapon. I found these contour sanding doohickeys while checking out some tool stores with Ava's dad over Christmas. They've inspired me to make my own 3D printed version in TPU, but more about that in an upcoming video. I do not want any sharp edges or pokey corners that can puncture the vacuum film, so I trimmed the edges to get rid of any sharp bits of epoxy, then went the extra step and rounded over all of the edges. To maximize my chances of being able to pull more than one hatch from each of these molds, I'm going to apply both wax and PVA. I was excited to see that I could get the exact same wax I used back in Denmark. Being a careful kind of guy, I started out waxing my test piece. It's been about 5 years since I last did anything like this, and I don't want to mess up the molds that I've already spent so much time on. With the first coat of wax applied, I waited for the surface to start turning dull before buffing and then applying a second coat. In the cold, this was not a fast process, so I tried heating up both the MDF and myself in the sun, but to little effect. Eventually I got 4 coats applied and could move on to the actual molds. In between coats of wax, I realized that the tool trailer is a giant embarrassing mess, so I trimmed a heel and cut a toe to be able to have more room for the air compressor. I have plenty of storage bins under the desk, and these will serve as long-time storage for stock overflow. A very nice viewer named Joe sent me this plasma cutter he had but didn't need. This is a very welcomed addition to the tool trailer. Thank you, Joe. Besides getting rid of a bunch of packaging and getting everything back in its rightful position, I also had this table saw I got a great deal on during Black Friday. This will take up a lot less room outside of the box. Really, my biggest motivation for tidying up the tool trailer was to make room for a new darling. This is the HTP Invertech 251. It is a TIG welder. Now I've also got part of next week's projects lined up. This is a new anchor roller here, but we'll get back to all of this next week. If it seemed like I was spinning my wheels there a little bit, it's because I was. I've been waiting for some vacuum infusion supplies to show up. This is one of 2 boxes. With the stuff that showed up here, we can do the test infusion, but in the second box is the core material for the hatches. So we're gonna have to wait for that to show up to do the actual hatches. My main reason for doing a little test infusion first is just to get a bit of practice before I put my actual molds in the line of fire. And also I want to do this test to see if I can use TotalBoat's high performance epoxy for infusion. Typically when you do infusion, you use a specific type of epoxy for that has a very low viscosity. But the high performance epoxy, when it's hot, it has a very low viscosity. So I'm thinking we might be able to get away with it. And it would be nice to just have to stock one type of epoxy. I've added a little bit of geometry to my test to better have it represent the actual hatches, and I've also prepared the core that's going to sit here. I am going to have to add little holes in this core because typically I think the core that's intended for resin infusion has little holes and channels in it, but other than that, It should be a good little test. This delightfully purple liquid is PVA mold release. You apply it by brush or spray, and once it's cured, it forms a water-soluble membrane that helps ensure that you can get your part to release from the mold. This green stuff is flow media. This stuff helps resin flow. More about that a little bit later. The blue plastic here is the vacuum film. I'm not particularly fond of the version I've got here, but this was what I could find locally. For the fiberglass, I'll use some 200 gram biaxial. That should do a nice job of conforming to the shape of the core without too much persuasion. After a third coat of PVA, I was ready to start assembling my puzzle. I applied vacuum tape along the edges of my bag and used a little bit of spray adhesive to hold the first layer of fiberglass in place. If this had been a completely flat part, I wouldn't have to bother with the spray, but to avoid any bridging around the little circle here, I need the glass to sit nice and tight against the surface. On the far side of the part is the resin line. This is where epoxy will flow into the part, and then closer to the camera is the vacuum line. The blue stuff on that line is a membrane that allows air through but not resin. This is complete overkill for a simple test like this, but I'm having fun and learning. While sealing the bag, I made sure to add a couple of pleats to have enough vacuum bag material to get into the little circle area. With the hoses connected, I could finally turn on the vacuum pump and start drawing a vacuum to test for any leaks. So far, so good. We've got the bag vacuumed down, but I've got the clamp here between the vacuum bag and my setup because there's a leak somewhere. And, well, we have a leak from the equipment, and I think we have a leak from the bag. Back when I did my first ever vacuum infusions, I only had the gauge on my resin trap to go by, and the resolution on that is not super high. This thing, the vac checker, that is a bit of a godsend. You can see tiny drops, which is why I know right now we've got a leak that's a little under 1 millibar per minute. Of course, the downside to having a super accurate instrument like that is the fact that what is the acceptable limit exactly? Yeah, I've done some Googling, and some clever people on the internet seems to think that anything below 1 millibar per minute might be okay. Any leak is bad, but below that threshold might be okay. Of course, I've got the hose clamped off here, so we're measuring the losses from here and further back. So somewhere in this there's a loss. We can isolate the resin trap and see if that improves our readings. Interestingly enough, that made things worse. We have more of a leak now. Maybe that's because there's less volume of vacuum between this thing and the pump. So I'm thinking the leak is somewhere in that area. As soon as the clamp is off, we're back down to the slow loss. I don't think the loss on this side is super important, because once the infusion is done, we can clamp it off. So really the only thing I need to worry about is the loss from the bag. I've moved the vac check over here so we can see how bad it is. There is one little challenge, and that's the frickin' city dump and the airport. It is impossible to hear any small leaks with all of that background noise. Let's clamp off the hose here, and let's see how bad the leak from the bag is. I would go as far as to call that catastrophic. So, dang it. Well, this is very annoying. No luck finding the stupid leak, so I think my only option here is to rebag. Unfortunately, that would have me run out of vacuum tape, so I need to rush to the fiberglass place to pick up more vacuum tape so I don't run out this weekend and spoil my chance of getting this video out on time. The next morning I returned, eager to redeem myself after yesterday's failure. Before rebagging, I made another attempt at sealing up the first bag, but was unsuccessful. I made a little test with an empty bag just to verify that I hadn't completely forgotten how to apply vacuum tape. The bag had 0 leaks, but again I observed a small leak around the vac checker. Very odd. Anywho, after having gone through all of the trouble of rebagging my little test board, we seem to have gotten lucky. It took a bit of effort to get here, but we finally have a bag that's good to go. So let's mix up some epoxy and cross our fingers. In lieu of hot weather here in Florida or my fancy epoxy heating box from Denmark, I've come up with this catastrophe of a fire hazard. It is a space heater inside of a cooler. If anybody knows of a good place in the US to have custom silicone heating mats made, please go ahead and leave a comment down below so I don't end up setting fire to the tool trailer. Of course, as soon as I draw the epoxy in, it's gonna drop to whatever temperature the rest of the stuff here is. But it's not that cold out today, it's about 17 degrees Celsius. The only reason I'm heating the epoxy is because it's been sitting out overnight and it's quite a big mass, so the epoxy is still cold from the night, if that makes sense. So yeah, we'll give that about 20 minutes and we can give this a shot. Well, that went fairly well. Everything looks pretty good. I'm excited to see what the bottom of this is going to look like. We do have a little bit of a dry spot here in this island, but I figured that was probably going to happen. This was a little bit of a test to see what you can get away with. The reason for the dry spot here is because there's no flow media going across. I did try and put in like a little bridge going across, but then it got fiddly, and then I just figured, we'll leave it out and see if it'll work. And well, it kind of worked. We'll see how that looks in the morning. So can you use TotalBoat's high performance epoxy for infusion? Yes, you clearly can. But it is not a real infusion resin, and it did slow down a lot in getting drawn across. It was a lot slower than the infusion resin I used back in Denmark for the rudder shells. Also, it kicked sooner here in the pot than I thought it was gonna, and I'd even split it into 2 cups to not have a big lump sitting in one spot. There are some things I could do to improve the performance of this epoxy in this scenario. Like for instance, if I had my silicone heating mat, I could heat all of this to have the epoxy remain nice and low viscosity. But yeah, I think it was a good test. It is the next morning. Let's see if we can get this thing liberated. We have a dry spot here and a little bit inside of the hole. Also, there has been a tiny bit of bridging along this edge here, but that was a very sharp edge. So yeah, other than that, looks pretty good. I've cleaned up the edges on my little test part here, so it's not so pokey. But yeah, I think this was a very successful test. We do have a dry spot here on the little island and the one on the back. The one on the island, I think I could have saved that with some flow media going across. The one on the bottom, that is probably due to the resin. So I think I could have saved that with having heat on the part while I was infusing it, or just using a proper infusion resin. So we made it about 10 inches before we ran into this little dry spot. So if you want to play around with infusion and you have some TotalBoat high performance epoxy kicking around, yeah, I would say go ahead and give it a whirl. If you notice the little bit of fuzzy stuff here, that is just remnants of the peel ply that was on here. That's not really an issue. I ended up using a little bit more resin than I thought I would. I mixed up, I think it was 450 some grams of resin. My part comes in at 420 grams and 242 grams of the part is glass. I had a really good vacuum on the part, so I believe that means the glass to resin ratio in the part should be something like 40% resin, 60% glass. That means I must have lost quite a bit of resin in the hose. I do have a tiny bit of bridging here that's going to be holding a little bit of resin. Also, the holes in the core are filled with resin, but yeah, that shouldn't be that much. I feel very well prepared to do the infusion of the actual hatches. Unfortunately, the core still hasn't shown up. I think there's some bad weather up in the northern part of the US that's really messing up shipping, because I've ordered a few different things this week and everything that's come up from north has been delayed. So yeah, hopefully the core will get here soon. This is why I don't really like being 100% real time with the videos, because any kind of shipping mistakes is just very annoying. But there's a bit of a silver lining to it. Like for instance, now I have time to get my hands on the proper adhesive, the 71 instead of the 77. So yeah, we'll get back to the vacuum infusion in a week or two. When we do get back to the infusion, it's going to be with a fun little twist, because one of the hatches is just going to be regular old boring e-glass. The other hatch is going to be super fancy space age with a couple of different types of carbon and some Kevlar in it. And there's a bunch of interesting compromises there that I think will make for a fun video. To not waste any more time waiting for stuff to show up, I think I'll make next week's video about the TIG welding darling. I've already taken it for a super quick spin and seen that it works. So we should be good to go. I've got a bunch of coupons here for practicing on, and I've also ordered, I think it's 20 pounds of scrap stainless to just practice on. After I updated my little parts list for the two engines earlier in this video, I have ordered the first batch of parts, about $2,000 worth of parts. Those are all the parts we'll need to be able to get the engines up and running so that we can test them for a few hours. I want to do that before I throw more new parts at them, just as a bit of a precaution. I think maybe with a bit of luck those parts should also get here next week, but we'll see. And that is going to be the end of this week's video, which is going to go live in like 2 hours, so I better get busy rendering. But yeah, I hope to see all of you guys back here aboard the catamaran next week for yet more glorious DIY fun. As always, feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like. See you!